This video is looking at the biological approach in psychology, and it's the last one we're going to be looking at because it's the most recent one to emerge in the timeline of psychology. It emerged in around the 1980s. So let's look at some general assumptions of the biological approach. So the biological approach assumes that everything psychological is at first biological. And this relates here to the third point, that much of human behaviour has a physiological cause, which may be genetically or environmentally altered. By physiological, we mean physical and biological. So the biological approach views human beings as biological organisms, and so biological psychologists provide biological explanations for all aspects of psychological functioning. Biological psychologists are particularly interested in the biological structures and processes that underpin human behaviour. So they're interested in brain structure and function, the genetic basis of behaviour, and showing how characteristics can be passed from generation to generation through genes, and the important role that chemical and hormonal changes in the nervous system play. So we're going to be looking at all of these factors in this video. More recently, biological psychologists have become particularly interested in Darwin's ideas about evolution and how this might apply to human behaviour. So this allows us to understand the adaptive significance of behaviours like aggression or depression or mate selection, for example. And then finally, although it might seem obvious, the biological approach believes that the mind lives in the brain and that all thoughts, feelings and behaviours have a physical basis. This seems obvious, but in comparison to, for example, the cognitive approach, this sees mental processes of the mind as separate from the physical brain. So this approach really does believe that the mind exists in the brain. So we're going to be breaking down and looking at each of these different aspects in turn. So we're going to start off by looking at the genetic basis of behaviour. So all of this is going to be quite familiar to you as you would have studied it previously in science, but it's important that we just refresh your memory of genes here. So biological psychologists are interested in studying the genetic basis of behaviour. So just to recap, when we're talking about genes, we're talking about the basic units of heredity. Heredity is the passing of characteristics from one generation to the next through genes. So your parents passing on traits and characteristics to you via genes. And it's the reason why people tend to take after their parents in terms of physical or psychological characteristics. So as you'll know from science, genes carry the instructions for particular traits and characteristics. So, for example, intelligence or temperament, personality. So genes, as we know, function in pairs. And it's the recombination of genes from parents to offspring that provides the basis for genetic variability. How a particular characteristic develops depends partly on the interaction of genes with other genes. It's very rare that traits are based on a singular gene. Often they're polygenic, meaning it's based on the combination of genes. In the case of, for instance, schizophrenia, there's over 200 genes that are involved in the disorder. Likewise for OCD, for example. So it partly depends on the interaction of genes with other genes, and partly on the interaction between your genes and your environment, which we'll look at a little bit later. The extent to which a characteristic is determined by genes, or our environment, is called the nature versus nurture debate. And I'm sure you're all very familiar with this idea. So, just to recap, so the genetic basis of behaviour. So each individual possesses unique combinations of genetic instructions, therefore we differ from each other in terms of particular traits. So some examples are personality, intelligence, problem-solving ability, for example. Some traits are more likely to be genetically determined than others, some are more environmental, and biological psychologists are interested in investigating the extent to which particular traits or behaviours are determined by genes or the environment or the interaction of both. So, one method of investigating the extent to which traits are determined by genes or the environment is via twin studies. So, we're going to be looking at a number of twin studies later on in the course, so it's important just to recap on exactly the different types of twins because they're really relevant here. So, twins provide us some really unique insights into whether a trait is likely to be genetically determined, because we can compare the traits present in monozygotic twins or dizygotic twins. So, if you remember monozygotic twins, we typically refer to these as identical twins, because they are 100% genetically identical, and this is because they're formed by one zygote, so one fertilized egg, then splitting into two identical eggs. In comparison to dizygotic or non-identical twins, which only share 50% of their genes, this is where we have two eggs that are fertilized by two different sperm, and so we've got two individuals at the end, which share the same number of genes as any two siblings would. So, with this in mind then, twins are really interesting because they allow us to establish concordance rates. So concordance rate is represented as a percentage, and it tells us the extent to which a pair of twins or two family members share similar traits or characteristics. So for example, what percentage of the time do both twins have schizophrenia if we know that one twin has the disorder? What percentage of the time does the grandchild of a person living with schizophrenia also have the disorder? So because we know the genetic relatedness of family members, so for instance we know that monozygotic twins share 100% of their genes and dizygotic twins share 50% of their genes, we can get an insight into whether a trait is likely to be inherited via genes passed on from that individual's parents, i.e. is it a genetic disorder? So I just want to show you this graph in a little bit more detail here. So this is a famous piece of research looking at family studies. This was by Gottman and looking at the incidence of schizophrenia in families. What we've got here on the left-hand side is the genetic relatedness. So this is the percentage of genes that are shared between any two individuals. So if we see any bars that are in red, we know that those individuals share 100% of their genes, as is the case with identical twins. They're identical because they share 100% of their genes. When their genetic relatedness is 50%, we can see this represented in blue. So you share 50% of your genes with your parents, 50% with your siblings, 50% with any children that you have, and non-identical or dizygotic twins share 50% of their genes as well. And likewise, we can look at the genetic relatedness of individuals who share 25% of their genes and then 12.5% of their genes. So the left-hand side gives us an indication of the genetic relatedness, or what percentage of genes are shared between two individuals. On the right here, we can see the concordance rates. Now, what we should expect, if schizophrenia is a genetic disorder, we should expect to see higher concordance rates for individuals that have greater genetic relatedness. So identical twins share 100% of their genes. The concordance rate for schizophrenia is 48% for monozygotic or identical twins, which means that if one identical twin has the disorder, 48% of the time the other twin also has schizophrenia. This tells us something very, very interesting. It tells us that schizophrenia is a partly genetic disorder, particularly when only 1% of the general population suffers from schizophrenia. However, it also tells us that it's not entirely a genetic disorder. We would expect, if schizophrenia was a completely genetic disorder, that the concordance rates for monozygotic twins would be 100%. When one twin has the disorder, 100% of the time their identical twin also has the disorder. And as we can see here, this simply isn't the case. So we can see that yes, it's partly genetic, but the environment also plays a role here as well. This is also illustrated when we compare the concordance rates between children, or let's take siblings, for example, and fraternal twins. So siblings, so you and your brother, for example, or you and your sister, you share 50% of your genes. If schizophrenia was an entirely genetic disorder, we would expect to see the concordance rates being 50%, which clearly we don't see here. But what's super interesting is that the concordance rates are different even though the genetic relatedness is the same. So fraternal twins or dizygotic, non-identical twins, the concordance rate is 17%. So if we take pairs of twins that are non-identical, if one twin has the disorder, then 17% of the time their twin will also have schizophrenia. But if we look at siblings, we can see that the concordance rate is only 9%, despite the fact that both dizygotic twins and siblings share 50% of their genes, or 50% genetic relatedness. So this tells us some really, really interesting information because it tells us just how important the environment also is in determining whether somebody is likely to suffer from schizophrenia. So we know that dizygotic twins, or any twins in fact, also share a considerable amount of their environment. So unlike siblings, which are born at different periods of time, dizygotic twins are born at the same time. So it means that they are sharing the womb, for example. It means that they're going to be raised in a very, very similar way. It means they're likely to be receiving the same nutrients, exposed to the same illnesses, receive the same sort of parenting and education and friendship group. And the environment for dizygotic twins is likely to be much more similar than the environment between any two siblings. And this accounts for the differences in concordance rates for dizygotic twins and siblings. So we're going to be looking at this a lot more next year, but this type of study, either twin studies or family studies, provide us some insight into whether a disorder is likely to be genetic or environmental, and the extent to which it is both genetic and environmental. But the big issue here is the confounding variable of the environment. Because twins are raised together, it's impossible to remove the impact that the environment is going to have on the expression of the disorder. So it means that, yes, identical twins have a high concordance rate, but is this because they share 100% of their genes, or is this because they share 100% of their environment? It's impossible for us to know. And so twin studies are good because they allow us to see the concordance rates and to get some insight into whether a trait or disorder is likely to be inherited. They don't tell us the whole picture because of that confounding variable of the environment. In order to remove that confounding variable, we'd need to conduct adoption studies, where we look at twins who are raised apart by being adopted into different families. Although, as you can imagine, these studies are really, really rare. When schizophrenia is only present in 1% of the population, and it's very rare for somebody to have twins, and it's even rarer for people to have twins that are adopted into different families, you can see why there might be difficulties conducting adoption studies into a rare psychological disorder. So more on this next year when we look at our options and we look at schizophrenia. Okay, moving on then. So as we mentioned, biological psychologists are interested in understanding the genetic basis for behaviour. However, it's really important that we understand that behaviour that is observed is not simply the result of the genes that we possess, but the interaction of these genes with our environment. So here we need to clarify the difference between the genotype, which is the genetic code that is sort of written in the DNA of an individual's cells, and the phenotype. This is like the observable physical, behavioural, or psychological characteristics. In other words, how the genes are actually expressed. You can remember them because obviously genotype is the genes that you inherit, and I was always taught that phenotype, phi, is sort of like the physical characteristics, although for us, we're more interested in the psychological characteristics. This might help you to determine whether something is the genotype or the phenotype. So our phenotype is the result of the interaction between our inherited genes and the environment. And while we would usually expect there to be quite a strong relationship between the two, that's not always the case. So a couple of examples just to illustrate this. So for example, you might inherit the trait for a particular genetic disorder, but if that's detected early enough, you might be able to control the expression of that disorder by changing your lifestyle or your environment or your diet, etc. So for example, you might have diabetes running in your family, but if you adopt an adequate diet, and if you exercise, then it won't express itself in the phenotype and you won't suffer from diabetes. We know that intelligence also is partly hereditary. So you inherit some genes which do code for various aspects of intelligence from your parents. However, your actual intelligence or IQ, or however you want to measure intelligence, is going to depend on for example, how much stimulation you received in your environment in those formative years, your diet, your education, all of these things. And finally, the last and probably most relevant example is to do with the expression of psychological disorders. So, for example, you might inherit a predisposition to a psychological disorder, for example, in this case, schizophrenia, but it may not express itself unless exposed to a particular environmental trigger or stressor. For example, smoking cannabis. And it's only when we have the interaction between our genotype and our environment that it's going to present in the phenotype, which is actually in the expression of the disorder. So somebody that knows that they've got schizophrenia running in the family by having parents or uncles or siblings, for example, with that disorder, can ensure that they minimise risks and minimise the influence of the environment by avoiding particular stresses that they know are likely to interact with their genetic or their genetic code, their genotype, and therefore can help limit or at least minimise their risk of developing the disorder. All right, and you can see this illustrated here in these images of identical twins. So these are monozygotic twins. They share 100% of their genes, which means they both share the same genotype for how wrinkles are expressed. However, they've been exposed to different environments. You can see very clearly here that the twin on the left has been smoking, and this has affected how her genotype, the gene for wrinkles, has been expressed in her phenotype, what her face actually looks like. So for us, we're more interested in psychological traits, but here it's very, very easy to see how the phenotype is expressed in terms of wrinkles here. All right, moving on to look at the other areas that biological psychologists are interested in. So increasingly, they're becoming really interested in how Darwin's theory of evolution might explain human behaviour. So all of this is going to be familiar to you, but just to recap, Charles Darwin, he argued that over time, organisms become adapted to their environment through biological evolution. So this refers to the changes that take place in the characteristics of a population over time. The mechanism behind biological evolution is natural selection. So individuals within a species differ from each other in terms of their physical characteristics and also in their behaviour. And some of this variation is inherited. So some of this variation in our genes, some of this variation in our behaviour and our physical characteristics is inherited from our parents. Because we all need to compete with each other for access to resources like food and shelter and mates, for example, those who survive this competition and go on to reproduce tend to have behaviours that are more likely to lead to survival and reproductive success than those who do not. So these behaviours then are passed on to offspring, and these traits and characteristics then become more widespread in the population. So through the process of natural selection, successive generations are going to develop behaviours that are even more likely to lead to survival and reproductive success. And some examples of this we've looked at already in the course. Some examples include intelligence, aggression, attachment, stress, and even particular mental disorders may have an evolutionary adaptive advantage. Finally, we're going to be looking at the influence of biological structures, followed by the influence of neurochemistry and hormones. So all of this will be just a summary of what you've already learned in biopsychology. So our nervous system and our brain have a large influence over our behaviour. Let's start with the human nervous system. So the nervous system is comprised of several connected systems. We've of course got our central nervous system, which comprises of our brain and spinal cord, and then we've got our peripheral nervous system, which comprises the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So the nervous system carries messages from one part of the body to another, for example, and neurons transmit nerve impulses in the form of electrical signals. Many of our aspects of behaviour are under neuronal control. So, for example, breathing, eating, even more complex things like sexual behaviour, for example. Another example you'll be very familiar with is the activation of the peripheral nervous system controlling our behaviour when faced with a stressor, for example, in the fight and flight response. We also know that our brain has a really large influence over our behaviour, particularly as biological psychologists would argue that the mind exists in the brain. So the largest part of our brain is the cerebrum. Yeah. And this makes up about 85% of the total mass of our brain. The outer surface of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, which is responsible for many of sort of the higher order functions that are more or less unique to humans. For example, complex thought and language. As you know, the cerebrum is divided into two halves called hemispheres, and many functions are lateralized to either the left or the right hemisphere. And then each hemisphere is then further divided into 4 different parts known as lobes, again with many localized functions. For example, we've got our frontal lobe, we've got our parietal lobe, our occipital lobe, and then our temporal lobe. Frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. And each of these lobes have many specialised, localised functions and primary cortices. So, for example, we've got the primary motor cortex, primary somatosensory cortex, primary visual cortex, and primary auditory cortex. And each of these obviously has a large influence over our behaviour. Biological psychologists are also interested in the effect of neurotransmitters and hormones over our behaviour. So again, this is just recapping what you've already learnt in biopsychology. So when a nerve impulse reaches the end of a neuron, a neurotransmitter is released. It travels from one neuron across the synaptic gap and then triggers nerve impulses in the receiving neuron by interacting with a specialised receptor site on that postsynaptic neuron. You know that we've got different types of neurotransmitters. We've got neurotransmitters that trigger nerve impulses in the receiving neuron, called excitatory neurotransmitters, and we've got those that inhibit nerve impulses in the postsynaptic neuron in order to calm the brain and sort of balance mood, and these are inhibitory neurotransmitters. An example of an excitatory would be dopamine, associated with sort of motivation and drive and goal-directed behaviour. And we've got serotonin as an example of an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which is responsible for maintaining stable mood. We've also got hormones, which have a large influence over our behaviour as well. So, as you know, hormones are chemicals that are produced by the endocrine glands. We've got examples of different endocrine glands here, for example. And obviously the pituitary gland as well, which together, all of these make up the endocrine system. In response to a signal from the brain, typically from our cortex, hormones are secreted into the bloodstream by the endocrine glands, and they travel to target cells in the body. And this is where they exert their influence and stimulate receptors, either in cells or further glands or muscles, for example. And then the presence of that hormone causes some physiological reaction to occur, which alters a cell's activity. So, for example, if we've got a surge of testosterone, particularly in males, then that can increase levels of aggression. So, just to sum up, biological psychologists are really interested in understanding the physiological basis underpinning human behaviour. So they're interested in brain structures, the nervous system, the genetic basis of behaviour, how neurochemistry and hormones all have an impact on our behaviour. They're also interested in looking at how Darwin's theory of evolution via natural selection can explain some traits that have evolved in humans because they provide us with an adaptive advantage.